Hi. So thank you for coming to this session. So this session is on the impact of online abuse, the importance of education and awareness raising in practice. We've got some great speakers, 4 presentations. How we're going to do it is one presentation, Q&A, second presentation, Q&A. So please use the chat online if you want to. And we've also got 2 roving mics with people attached to them, so they can be running around if you've got a question at the end. And then just so I remember, we've got 2 exits, so if you're at the top, please use the top one. We had a little bit of a bottleneck getting it out then, we lost valuable time. So there's 2 exits. Okay, and my name is Dr. Teresa Redmond. I'm a research fellow here at PIER, so it's just great to see you all. So I'm going to start by introducing our first speaker, and that is Dr. Elly Hanson, a clinical psychologist. So would you like to come up, Elly?
So should I stand? Okay. Okay. Yeah, thank you. It is such a privilege and honour to be here today, and I've just already been absorbing the fantastic energy of the conference and the real passion and determination that we clearly all share to address this growing, this growing problem that causes so much suffering. So I am going to be using this slot this morning to talk about the impact of, we can call it online child sexual abuse, or maybe more accurately tech-assisted, given that it often has offline elements as well. So first of all, what are we talking about when we say online child sexual abuse? There are many different forms, and we were, the film that we saw earlier highlighted a couple of those forms. And it's also safe to say that we can't come up with a comprehensive list. This crime is changing, it's growing, and new forms are developing the whole time. But to name some of them, we've got, as you saw in the film, offline abuse that is shared, so contact abuse happening often in the home that is then shared with unknown others online. We've also got abuse that may be happening online or offline and shared with other young people or peers. Contact abuse that's commissioned or bought online, so increasingly we're seeing pimps often recruiting children through social media and then selling them to others. And I should say that all of these forms can overlap and intermingle. Online sexual blackmail, as we saw earlier, that an offender will gain an image and then use that to blackmail the child to produce more and more severe images. And that can overlap or happen in tandem with online grooming, where the child is deceived by the offender into believing that they have a relationship there, that the offender doesn't have the intentions that they do have, and so can be groomed into feelings of love and loyalty, and then become embroiled in the abuse that way. And then I've also, you can have sexual images that may be created consensually, for example, within a peer-to-peer romantic relationship, and then they are shared non-consensually with the wider peer group. And, we're seeing that peer-led abuse. That is one of the many areas of online abuse that's on the increase. So when I was asked to talk about the impact, I'm faced with this complexity, and everybody's different. We can't say that everybody's going to be affected in the same way. That will depend on a whole range of factors, including the nature of the abuse, but also the nature of the support that the child or young person receives. And unfortunately, we know that a lot of the time they're faced with victim-blaming responses and minimisation, and not that support, which has a big impact on the impact. So yes, faced with this complexity, I'm going to kind of zoom in on 2 forms here. But a lot of what I say will be relevant to that wider picture. So child sexual abuse, and again, it's actually the 2 forms that the film was zooming in on. Child sexual abuse that's taking place offline that is then recorded and shared as CSAM, which has previously been described as child pornography. So in this And when I talk about this abuse, I'm going to be particularly highlighting some research done by Leanna MacDonald's team, who's here today in Canada, a fantastic large-scale survey of adult survivors of this form of abuse. And what that found is that, and this is backed up by further research, that the majority of perpetrators of this form are family members. 49% of that sample experienced organised abuse. So there's more than one individual involved in that contact abuse. And we're talking about abuse that is starting at a young age. Again, as we saw in that film, 87% the abuse started before they were 11, and for 42% they were abused for over 10 years. So it's typically with this abuse, it's starting young, it's perpetrated by the family and maybe other individuals working in an organised group, and it's going on for a very long time. And I'm going to come back to that and highlight some more dynamics of that. But the other form I'm going to spotlight is this kind of overlap between online grooming, online blackmail, and image sharing. And to spotlight that, I'm going to particularly focus in on some research that I had the privilege of being a part of with colleagues Catherine Hamilton-Giakritsis at Bath, Tony Beach, and Helen Whittle. And we did a mixture of interviews and survey with young people who'd experienced a mixture of different kind of tech-assisted abuse, and this was a major thing that they were reporting. This abuse, as will be, as you'll be aware of, the majority of victims are tweens and teens when that's happening. So they're going online and they've maybe been entrapped by an offender, or it may be perpetrated by a peer. And there is this overlap between what may be happening within the peer group or in a romantic relationship offline, but then the sharing of those images non-consensually, or through dynamics of blackmail. And we know that this abuse is absolutely on the rise. A recent survey found that 15% of US adults report at least one incident of online sexual abuse, and the research is showing that the majority of young people now are being sexually solicited online. So even if they don't go on to have longer term abuse, this is, young people are running this gauntlet. This is what their world is now. And perpetrators of that abuse, like I said, they may be strangers online, it may be peers as well. So I just want to kind of zoom in now a little bit on talking about some of the dynamics of the first form of abuse, child sexual abuse happening offline. Now, clearly, the recording and images are part of a much wider regime of abuse going on here. And just to think about the dynamics of the images, that they are often being made with a kind of production quality. So the child has the sense that they are being made for other people. I'm just going to come forward to be able to see my slides properly. So one woman in the C3P survey, I had to smile nicely and pretend I liked it, just like those women in the movie, because that was what the men who would get it wanted to see. Sometimes they did not want it at all as an adult girl, but wanted as much crying as possible. So I just had to deliver what was asked of me. So there's a sense of performing for this camera and the feeling of exposure that comes with that. By the way, I have got a lot of quotes from survivors, and I will be reading them all out, so don't try and read as I speak, because it works. Apparently that causes a kind of mind block. And that actually, with this kind of chronic use of the photo and images and video, that the child is having to adapt to that. They are having to find a way of maybe dissociating, but also maybe finding some, they may experience sexual arousal, that their bodies are having to adapt to what is going on. I thought everybody would then see what I was really like, badly depraved. You learn to use your body so it will hurt the least and even give you some pleasure. And then that's right there recorded on film. So they're in this kind of no-win to try and adapt to it, but then the worry that that is then perceived by others as them wanting it or enjoying it. Also within this form of abuse, it's often involving children who are coerced into sexual activity with other children, which is then adding a whole nother layer of shame and self-blame. As this survivor says, if the perpetrators push you into the role of the perpetrators, that is, require you to abuse others yourself, then you're even more likely to be silent, because you ultimately feel more of a perpetrator than a victim. And if they furthermore have that on film, you go totally mute. So this again speaks to the impact of the images, that it works to silence victims even further. We know that many victims, it's very, very difficult to disclose, but the existence of images then adds that other layer. And often within this abuse, they're shown recordings of both their own abuse and others as a further silencing and shaming mechanism. And then just turning to the other spotlighted form of abuse that I'm talking about today, online grooming, blackmail, or image sharing. Some common dynamics to this, that if grooming has occurred, there may be feelings of trust, love, and loyalty to the offender. But then if it switches into blackmail, and the child is feeling that they have to produce images to stop the images the offender already has being circulated, they may be living under a regime of absolute fear and terror. Some of the young people that we spoke to, I was terrified. I thought, oh my God, I need to do it, or else that would happen. I couldn't concentrate because I was thinking about all the possibilities of what could happen. Like the offender could have shown these images to people here. Other dynamics that we came across with this form of abuse was often emotional blackmail. So a lot of, particularly from other peers, a lot of pressure, I'm really depressed, I need you to send me these images, otherwise I'm going to kill myself, this kind of thing. So Jess, 17, sometimes I'd say night and then leave, but I tried not to do that because that would make him really sad and depressed. And so I'd wake up in the morning and find that he'd been crying all night and hurting himself because I said such a particularly harsh comment. She's just talking about saying goodnight to him. But this was very common that we came across this. And another key dynamic that was common is control of the nighttime space. So the night being a particular high-risk zone when the offender would know that the child maybe had less supervision, there weren't other people around. And the offender actually, we see from other research, the offenders can often see the night as kind of giving themselves permission. They're also not around other people that might be, that might inhibit them otherwise. So it's a big theme, young people who were absolutely, apart from all of the other impacts, they were just very tired and couldn't concentrate because they'd had these nights of abuse that no one else knew about. A lot of the time I would fall asleep on the phone. If I woke up the next day and my phone was next to me, I knew that the next day I was in trouble. So here's a young person who, she's being abused online, she couldn't help but fall asleep, but because then she wakes up, she discovers she hadn't met his last demands, she was going to be in trouble that day. So this all speaks to some of the kind of impact during the abuse. And I want to now think about the kind of impact longer term. And, it's important that we ground this in the much wider literature that we have on the impact of sexual abuse in general. It's a really rich research literature that has really helped to disentangle the impact of other things going on. And what this finds is that sexual abuse increases the risk of a whole range of difficulties, and in a very serious and sizable way. And I won't go through this whole list, but it's things like drugs and alcohol problems, suicidality, self-harm, dissociation, aggression, depression and anxiety, relationship and intimacy difficulties. Re-victimization is a really big one. If you've been sexually abused, that then creates a risk for further abuse, and there's a lot of psychology to that. As well as also beyond mental health, physical health. The ability to make the most of life's opportunities is fundamentally compromised. And for example, academic difficulties or employment problems. Now, when I present this, I don't want this to be kind of seen in a deterministic way. Everybody's different. I am not saying that people are then kind of signed up to this for the rest of their life. Healing absolutely is possible, and a large part of my work, I'm involved in that. And people can have incredible resilience in the face of very serious abuse. So for me, I would use this list, this understanding, to kind of drive empathy, compassion, and a curiosity and an open-mindedness. And that there are, the key point is that there are things that we can do when we're supporting survivors and as a society that can chip away at this list, that can help people heal, recover, and have resilience. So yeah, just some quotes that speak to that list from our research, and also research with victims of online abuse carried out in Sweden by Malin Jolby and colleagues. Everything became much more precarious. Everything just fell apart for me. From 12 till probably 15, I had, I would say, nightmares almost every night, more than one nightmare. I hated myself mostly, just really low, bad about myself. I was self-harming. I didn't really understand why I was so depressed. Often people can't, there isn't necessarily that cognitive understanding of why this impact has happened, but it can kick in. And it may not always happen during the abuse, but actually happens sometime after, when the realization of what's happened starts to take hold. And for me, each one of these things that young people are sharing with us is just, it's important that we just take a moment to kind of really listen and take it in, and that there's all of this hidden suffering that children and young people and later adults are experiencing and often holding inside themselves without anyone else knowing. And even if they do disclose, we know that certainly within the UK, the majority of these young people are not receiving support for this. They're not receiving help, and it's an absolute travesty. So I want to just, in the remaining time that I have, just zoom in on the particular aspects of online abuse that can complicate this impact. We know that this is the kind of overall impact of sexual abuse, but how can the online aspect add complexity? And this is particularly important given that traditionally online abuse has been minimised, and this was a big finding in some other research that we did, where professionals sometimes struggled to see the seriousness and would minimise it and not take it as seriously as contact abuse, and have thoughts like, well, couldn't they just close the computer? So that kind of minimisation overlapping quite quickly with victim blaming. Whereas actually what we know is that if there's an online dimension, that can worsen things and complicate things. So I'm just going to zoom in on the image dimension and why this is so difficult. We've got all the facets, all the elements that involves, the production of the images like we saw, what that, how that feels when that is happening, the feeling of exposure, the feeling of this much wider audience. And then there's the image itself, which is fundamentally a deception. The image is the offender's version of events. And often it has been very much choreographed by those offenders to fit their narrative that blames the victim and exculpates themselves. So it is, it's not truth. It is a certain image that that offenders are often using to present their own deceptive lies. Then we move to the fact that these images are often, there's a sense of total permanence, that we can't get rid of them, and that combines with reach, that they are going out, there's a sense of them going out in a huge way to a huge number of people. And, the ranks of individuals indulging in a sexual interest in children online is growing. It's in its millions, and it's going up. And so there's a sense of how many people have seen these images. And then there's the impact of thinking of abusers viewing them and trading them. And also there's the impact of other people viewing them, police officers, or the fear that if I tell somebody about the abuse, that will send them down an avenue, or where they will then find my images, and the humiliation of not just abusers viewing them, but other people as well. And as we know, that is a key inhibitor during online abuse, that the fear that family and friends may see these images. So this image dimension leads into a whole range of complexities for survivors. As I said, it's silencing. And crucially, what it leads to is the experience of ongoing abuse. This abuse is not ending for victims. We're not talking about post-traumatic stress. We're talking about present traumatic stress. The feeling that I am still being abused. Every time another offender looks at my image, I am being abused. I know that these pictures will never end and that my virtual abuse will go on forever. Since he put these pictures on the internet, my abuse is still going on. Anyone can see them, people ask for them, and are still downloading them day after day. I just feel like I don't know what's out there, and I don't know who's watching, and I don't know what people are doing regarding to me. So this kind of pervasive fear, uncertainty, anxiety, and that massively overlaps with the shame. It was all the shame. It kind of stopped me. All the shame. I was so extremely ashamed. And that kind of shame is maybe the feeling that is most difficult to bear because it really paralyzes you. It affected how I wanted to live. And this fits with what we more widely know about the impact of sexual abuse, that shame is really at the heart of it, and that is such an inhibitor to moving forward, and can be compounded by other people's reactions. And a more recent study found that 74% of survivors of CSAM said that they felt ashamed or humiliated nearly all the time. So this is kind of as an ongoing experience. And then just the second element, just a further element of impact of the images is the fear of being recognised and the re-victimisation that may lead to. In the survey by C3P, 69% worried about being recognised, and that went up to 80% of under 40s. So that fear is kind of increasing in younger age groups who are more concerned about their images being out there on the internet. When I'm around people, I always think, are they thinking about what happened, like they might know about it? I live fairly isolated, always being afraid of being seen, so wanting to shut oneself off in case of being recognised. I perceive the world as terribly unsafe. I often feel like a hunted animal. It's very clear that this is due to the existence of the photo imagery. And indeed, their fears are often not unfounded. This is not a paranoid fear. What the C3P survey found was that actually 30% of these survivors had been identified by somebody online or in person who had seen their images. So this was not a paranoid fear. 87% of them, of that 30%, reported further trauma as a result. 82% were actually targeted by one or more of these people. 71% of that group were propositioned or re-victimised. 43% received blackmail threats. So that there is a very active offender group who are looking to locate and identify the victims in the images and then further harass and abuse them. And we cannot lose sight of that. And then lastly, another dynamic of the online tech-assisted dimension is the obscured power and felt complicity. And this is a really, I have touched on this as we've gone along, but where there is physical separation, we know that offenders are having to depend on these other methods: deception, manipulation of attachment needs, blackmail, threats. And so then there isn't that, in contact abuse, maybe for onlookers, for others, there may be, it may be more clear to them the offender's control through physical force. Without that, the power dynamics are more obscured. And this dovetails with the tendency that many people have to minimize abuse and to victim blame, sometimes in quite subtle ways. And this relates to other set of research looking at just world theory, where people don't want to believe that the world is a place where bad things happen to innocent people. It's adaptive to kind of think, if I do the right thing, good things will happen to me. And sexual abuse fundamentally shatters that assumption. And so for many people, there is a temptation to try and fit it into that logic model. Well, maybe the victim did something, or maybe it wasn't so bad. and the dynamics of online abuse can kind of dovetail with that. So we find that shame and self-blame are absolutely huge here. And that's the survivor doing that to themselves, but also people in their circle doing that to them as well. And the tragic irony is that these dynamics, this obscured power, heighten the impact of sexual abuse rather than reduce it. I know I'm probably out of time. Yes. Okay, right, yes. But just wanting to really bring home this point about victim blaming, and I think it's really important because in this audience, you know, it's not something that we're going to be doing. We are facing the problem, the seriousness, the impact, but victim blame is just such a common dynamic out there in society which is compounding the impact, and unless we tackle it, we're not going to get very far. So Melanie, people were calling me a slag. I couldn't get on the bus. That's why I couldn't go out of the house. Some of them were from school. I started to think that it was true, like what they were saying. I just wanted to feel better in myself. I felt really embarrassed because your parents saying something like that, it's like what I've done is embarrassing to the family or something. It made me feel like I'd done something wrong. Now, this is a girl who experienced online sexual blackmail from the ages of 11 to 13. She was having to produce very humiliating videos in the shower, you know, on a daily basis for this offender. Her parents kind of blamed her. They didn't want her to get mental health help. At school, she was given a lesson in online safety, which was just, you know, totally victim blaming. And in parallel with this, you know, sadly, her cousin experienced a rape. And what she shared with me was the complete difference in response to her cousin's rape, which was taken seriously, therapy, etc., and this that she experienced. So, you know, her story really brought it home, this difference in response that victims of online abuse are often experiencing. And Mark, he's talking about some online safety at school. It felt like they were saying, oh, you're so stupid, basically, for doing what you did. I don't know if that's what they were trying to say, but that's what it felt like to me. It made me feel quite bad about myself. And you know, you'll have all of these slides, but that was then feeding into all of the young people that we interviewed in our research blame themselves. And we didn't specifically ask them about self-blame, but they all shared it with us. But then at the end of the interview, we asked them any words that they would like to share with other survivors. And this was a really salient point, that they didn't want others to blame themselves. It's not your fault, and don't let anyone act like it's your fault, because it's not. I'd want to reinforce the fact that you're not to blame. No matter what you think you've done that has made you deserve this punishment and pain, it's not true. Everyone deserves to be happy and safe. And those words from that survivor really sum it up. So what's the way forward from here? And you know, this is going to be the topic of the whole conference, but just kind of 3 key points for me. We need prevention, which is going to involve robust regulation. And you know, it's far too late in the day, but you know, let's get on with it now. And education that we're going to hear about. Those are 2 key strands of our prevention response. Therapeutic support, and I'm delighted to pick up from Graham Dacre's earlier announcement of a project where, with the Embrace charity, who I think are here in this room, hello Anne, we're going to be leading a project designed to provide therapeutic support for long duration, that's validating, trauma-informed for victims of online abuse, and we're really excited about taking that project forward. It's such a privilege. And then lastly, we need to be thinking about increasing justice, both through you know, more resourcing of law enforcement, bringing more offenders to justice, more appropriate sentences. Some of the sentences are absolutely shocking, and I'm doing a bit of work with some colleagues here today on that to try and up those sentences, but also expanding what we mean by justice. When we ask victims what justice means to them, it's a lot more than conviction and sentence. In the US, they have rolled out a notification scheme. You know, CSAM is not a victimless crime. Let's make sure that we don't treat it as if it is. So they have rolled out a notification scheme where CSAM survivors are notified if their images are found in a seizure, and they can then access financial redress. Now, that is a complex process, but I think other jurisdictions need to be thinking along those lines, reviewing that, and seeing what we can do to increase justice for victims. And throughout all of this, we clearly need the involvement and the empowerment of people with lived experience to help us guide the way. Apologies for going over, but thank you very much.